All right, so it's about that time, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Again, my name is Todd Blomquist. I work for the Grants Pass School District, and we're here with two amazing individuals who are going to give you great insights tonight. So Dr. Leona O'Keefe is with us, and she is the Deputy Health Officer for Public Health. I think Michael Weber might be here as well from County Health. And then we have Dr. Scott Nelson, who serves here at Asante in Grants Pass. And without further ado, I think Dr. Nelson, you're up first, so I'll go ahead and share the screen. And again, if you folks online have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. The chat is a little hard to answer all the questions and keep them in context. So if you could put them into the Q&A, we'll try to get them answered as they come in. So here we go. I will share my screen.
All right, well, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to be able to meet and talk about, I think, important information. We are excited to be here and to share what we know and about the vaccine and about COVID and just everything that's going on. And I thought tonight I would take a little different approach than just talking specifically about the vaccine. We live in a different world today. We live in a place where information is readily available on our phones, on the internet. We get information from Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and just all sorts of information, or all sorts of places to get our information from. And I wanted to start tonight by just talking about, where do we get credible information? Where can we go to know exactly what to believe? I think as we try to navigate our way through really what is a morass of information out there, who do we trust? Where can we go to really know the truth? And who do we turn to? And so that's really what I wanted to start talking with tonight. And so Todd, if you could go to the next slide for me, thank you. I would just start with this. How do doctors know what the right thing to do is? We all have Facebook, we all have Twitter and YouTube. We all see all of the things that everybody else does. We read the news just like everyone. But how does a physician know what to recommend to a patient when they're talking about, in our case tonight, a vaccine? And I think that's a great question to ask. We live in a very small community. I know most of our physicians in town. I have talked to almost all of them about whether or not they've been vaccinated and their thoughts and feelings on the vaccine. And while there may be some that I have missed, I don't know of any of our physicians that I interact with who have not been vaccinated and who do not recommend the vaccine to their patients. And so that's different than what we hear when we go out into the world. And so what is it that we're seeing and reading and understanding that's different than what everybody else is? And so I just wanted to talk briefly about that tonight. I'm a surgeon. And so, how did I learn to do what I do? And how do I know what's the right thing to recommend? Well, I've spent a lot of time going to medical school, but really a lot of the information that we have is tradition. So in residency, I would operate with people. They would tell me this is how we do it. And that's how I would learn how to do it. But more than that, thankfully, we have scientific research and we have studies that are done to kind of pit one thing against another. What's the best thing to do? Let's try it on 50% of people and not on the other 50%. Let's see what the results are and which one actually works and doesn't work. And so we do a lot of that. And that research is then published in a lot of different journals. And so all physicians know certain journals. And you've heard of many of these, the New England Journal of Medicine, Cancer, the Lancet. These are all publications that we as physicians receive. And each of these has the latest research that is being done to determine what's the best thing to do for people. And in our specialties, we all have journals that we follow and read on a regular basis to know what's the best thing to do for each of us. So Todd, could you go to the next slide? And so we need to talk a little bit about what medical research is. In my prior life, as a resident, I did a lot of medical research and I published a number of papers. And so I'm well versed in this process, and it is an arduous process to undertake medical research and then to have your study published in a journal. We have to admit that research is not perfect. It is done by imperfect people asking difficult questions and trying to come up with answers. And if we look back at the history of medicine, which is one of my favorite things to study, I think we can all see that there's been an evolution. We don't bleed people anymore when they're sick. We don't believe in the four humors like they used to back in the days. Things have evolved And that's because scientists, physicians always are asking questions, and they're always trying to push the boundaries. And that is a clunky process of trying to figure out what's the right thing to do for people as we move forward. In the United States, an organized process to figure out how do we do scientific research, what are the steps that are best to kind of watch and make sure that scientific research is being done well and that it's credible and that it's acceptable, has been something that has been developed over 100 years. For all of you English teachers out there, if you've read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, that was actually one of the first published books back in 1904 about the meatpacking industry in Chicago that changed how the United States conducted research and protected itself from outside entities. That book changed the course of everything, and it actually was one of the reasons why we have the Food and Drug Administration today, which was created in the 1930s. That the FDA has really been assigned by the government to make sure that things that we talk about and do and give to each other, as far as medicines go or surgical procedures, have been approved by a credible body of individuals to say, yes, this is studied appropriately. We feel comfortable in recommending this. Like everything, they haven't always been 100% correct. But by and large, this is a system that has worked well and served us well as a public for almost 100 years now. And so all drugs, including vaccines, really undergo a very rigorous testing process before they are approved for the public use. And all first world countries have such standards that they follow, and most of them actually follow the lead of our Federal Drug Administration, Food and Drug Administration. England, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, all of these countries have similar standards. They all follow our lead in trying to approve medications for their populations. So again, this has been something that has evolved over time, but really has been the mainstay for where we go to get approval for various things to recommend to the public. So if you want to go to the next slide for me, Todd. So really, what is the role of the physician in all this? Well, our role is to take the information from the medical research that we read in journals, recommendations from the FDA on approved medications, and try to apply it to an individual. And there is a nuance to that. We call it medical practice for a reason, because some of it is practice. There isn't always the right solution for every patient, and not every drug is the right fit for every patient. Not every surgery is the right thing to do for every patient. And so the role of the physician is then to take the information that we have from the medical research or whatever, and to look at our patient with all of their nuances, and then try to make a good decision about what is the best thing to do for you in your situation at this time. And so as a physician, we really need to know where good information is found. So as I said, I have published a number of papers in my life, and it takes a long time to collect all the information, to go through it, to look at it with a statistician to make sure that our numbers are correct. And then when you submit a paper for publication, it has to be peer reviewed. So there is a team of other physicians or scientists who have to look at your research and say, did you follow the scientific model? Is this really safe? Did you ask the right questions? Are your conclusions valid for whatever you were studying? And I bring that up because the vaccines that we're going to talk about tonight have gone through an incredible amount of scrutiny to get to where they are, which was FDA approval, finally. In fact, if you want, you can go to YouTube and you can watch the entire FDA submission process that Pfizer did for their vaccine back in December to the FDA Advisory Committee. It's 8 hours and 41 minutes long. And you can watch the scientists tear apart and put back together the entire study that Pfizer did to determine whether or not the vaccine was safe. And I did watch it because I was curious as this was coming out. Is this really an appropriate medication for my patients? Is it appropriate for me? Is it appropriate for my family? I had many of the same concerns that other people did. This was a vaccine that was developed pretty quickly in comparison to others. Did they really do their research? Did they really look at all of the questions and concerns that I would have as a physician in order to recommend this to my patients and to take it for myself? And so if you're looking at where is good information found, it's really found at the source. And that source is going to the teams of scientists or researchers that are putting these things together and then scrutinizing the data that they are presenting, their outcomes, their complications. What are we really seeing? That does take a level of education, I guess, that is required. And that's why, medical school is so long, is because you're trying to learn how to speak that language and understand what's happening. But in essence, that is, what we are doing as physicians as we try to learn more about this information and make sure that we're recommending good things for the public and for our patients and for ourselves. So Todd, can you go to the next slide, please? So here it is. This was the publication that was done December 31st, 2020 from the Pfizer company. And those are all the scientists who were involved in the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. And this was the publication that was printed in the New England Journal of Medicine to say, here's our results. So we did a trial. They had 21,000 people who got the vaccine and 21,000 people who didn't get the vaccine. And then they published the findings. Here's how many people got a COVID infection. Here's how many people didn't get a COVID infection. Here were their complications. Here are the things that happened to these 21,000 people in our study. And here's our conclusions. And that was the paper that they spent 8 hours and 41 minutes scrutinizing as they brought it before the FDA subcommittee. And so if you want to look at the medical journal or the information, you can go online, look up the New England Journal of Medicine. You can read the study that was published to say, here's how the vaccine works. Here's what we saw. And that's really the most credible source of information that I think anybody can have, because that's the data that everybody's looking at. As we look at news reports, as we read things online, as we hear YouTube videos about this and that, there's so much contradictory information. As an individual, I would throw my hands up and say, I don't know what to do anymore. And so you have to go back to the source. And this is the source of the data right here. This is the publication that we look at as physicians to say, is this a valid thing or not? So Todd, can you go to the next slide? So what are we seeing today in Josephine County? And maybe this is where we can be most helpful, because we do actually have our little own perfect science experiment going on. Half of our community is vaccinated and half of our community is not vaccinated. And so if I go back to my 5th grade science fair project, that's exactly what we do. We take one thing and we give it to half the population and the other half we don't, and then we see what happens. Well, here are our results right now. Currently, 93% of all our hospital patients are unvaccinated. That is exactly what we're seeing. Currently, 100% of our ICU patients are unvaccinated. And we were approaching 1,000 new cases of COVID a week. And we have about a 6 to 7% admission rate, which means that we have 60 to 70% or 60 or 70 people being admitted to our hospital on a weekly basis. And we have a 2 to 3% mortality rate. And that number may be going up here as time goes on. We're seeing a lot of people pass away, unfortunately, from COVID in our little community. But what that shows me is that the data that we read about in the publication from Pfizer, that their vaccine is about 95% successful at stopping people from getting a COVID infection. And again, it's not 100%. And we've got 93% of our patients in the hospital who are unvaccinated, and we have a population that's half and half. That data is bearing out in our little science experiment here. And it does tell me that the vaccine works, and it has been proven to be safe. And we're seeing it in our community. Things are not going well for people who are not vaccinated, and that's a huge concern for us. And so, last slide, Todd, I'm just going to wrap up by saying, this has been, without a doubt, a crazy time for me to watch so many people turn and get information from sources that are less than reliable. And I would even put out there that, CNN, Fox News, all of these news agencies, as they're writing things, are not necessarily reliable sources for information at times. And that's where we have really gotten ourselves into a quandary. That is where people have just got themselves all turned around. And because we're hearing so many things from so many different sources, it is really hard to know what to do. So we do have to go to good sources of information. And so for us as physicians, we have to go back to the publications, the science, the data. What are we seeing? And then we have to look at how it's playing out in our community. And that's really where I have been as a provider, is looking at the data and then looking to see what's happening in our community and recognizing, yeah, the science is holding true with what we're seeing, regardless of what everybody else in the world is saying. The data from the science is good. We're seeing it play out in our community. And so, that's why I think myself and Dr. O'Keefe feel so passionately about speaking about what we're seeing and the importance of recommending the vaccine to people. So we do need to know where good sources of information are located and then to trust them. And the CDC, PubMed, which is where you can turn to all of the journal articles that are published, these have always been reliable sources for us as physicians, and we have trusted them for decades. And they do have, I think, decades of experience and reliability behind them, which we have to trust. And maybe the last thing that I would just add before I close, honestly, is we have lost trust in our society. We just seem to not believe anything that people say anymore. And when we do that, it becomes so hard to know where to turn for good information and who to believe. But, I think for us and for myself personally, these are the sources of information that we have watched and that we trust. And I think the reason why I have more confidence in them now is because we're seeing that information play out in our own little science experiment here in our community. And so I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. O'Keefe to talk more about the vaccine and its safety and all of the things with that. But I just wanted to start off our conversation today by just reiterating we need to know where to find good information, and that good information is located in these sources that I think most people don't turn to. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. O'Keefe. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nelson. So as Todd introduced me, I'm a family medicine physician. I've been in the area for a few years and recently joined the public health department to help with things related to COVID. So I'm going to go into more details about the vaccines themselves. Please do keep typing your questions into that Q&A. We want to answer all of your questions. So as I'm talking, if you're thinking of questions, go ahead and put those in there. So why are we focusing so much on the vaccines? In general, in medicine, we really prefer to prevent disease rather than treat disease. Whether we're talking about diabetes or high blood pressure, syphilis, or COVID, it's always safer to prevent the disease from coming in the first place. And vaccines help to do that by decreasing the number of people who get infected. That also helps to decrease the spread of the disease so that fewer people are impacted. It decreases socioeconomic impacts. And by that, I mean your ability to go to work and earn a paycheck and use that money to take care of your family, your ability to physically take care of your family, and to take part in the things that you enjoy in life. So by decreasing illness, we're helping you to maintain those things. By decreasing illness, we also decrease the number of people who end up in the hospital. And that's important for you as an individual. Being hospitalized, it can be scary and expensive, and it can really interfere with your life and the things that you want to be doing outside of the hospital. And furthermore, as we know right now, the hospital is beyond capacity in terms of number of beds and staff available to take care of patients as well as we'd like to. And so if we can keep people out of the hospital, it allows those who still need that hospital level of care to access the care. And then, of course, we want to decrease the number of people who die from disease. So the vaccines have shown that all of this is possible, and that's why we're focused so much on these vaccines. And furthermore, this particular vaccine is really one of the most effective and safest vaccines we've ever seen. And I'll go into more detail about what that actually looks like. But so far, these vaccines have been given to 200 million people in the US, 2 billion people in the world. And the reason those numbers are important is when we do these scientific studies that Dr. Nelson just outlined for you, the greater the number of people who have the intervention, whether it's a certain diet, an exercise, or a certain surgery, or a pill, or a vaccine, the greater the number of people who have that intervention done, the easier it is for us to know that the positive result that we're seeing is not just a coincidence. It's a true positive result. And also, the more confident we can be that we're seeing any possible negative impacts that we don't want to have happen. And we can be reassured that given how many people have received these vaccines, we're pretty well aware of what the negative potentials are and that the positive impacts are real. Right now, we're in a little bit of a time crunch with the COVID vaccines, meaning, you know, the virus is changing over time, and the longer it's allowed to change and the more people it can bounce between, the more it can change even further. And so there's a concern that over time, the vaccines may not be as effective if the virus keeps mutating like this. And of course, we want to prevent as many deaths as possible, and the vaccines can do that. So that's why there's more of a push on the timeline, and particularly as we're in such a severe surge right now. And, you know, we really do want to end this as quickly as possible. And I would add with as many lives and families intact as possible. And that the science and the evidence show that that is more likely with the vaccines than through the disease itself. So how do these actually work? So scientists were able to look at the virus, and they noticed that the virus has these things called spike proteins. And these are unique to the virus itself. We don't have any of these spike proteins in our body, which is pretty cool because that means that they were able to create the vaccines to teach our body to recognize these spike proteins without harming our own body. So what they did was they took a piece of the instructions, the recipe from the virus, and they took the part of the instructions that say how to make the spike proteins. And those instructions are called mRNA. Now, mRNA is really fragile. It breaks down really quickly. So in order to make it stay intact long enough to make it to your body cells, they surrounded the mRNA with salts and fats, things that our body is used to, but that keep this mRNA intact. And so they, through the vaccine, put this in your body, and the instructions, the mRNA, enter your cells, and they tell your body how to make these spike proteins. So your body makes all of these little spike proteins, and your body says, whoa, I don't know what these are. I've never seen these before. This is not good. This is foreign. I'm going to build an immune response, an army to fight these off. And that's how you form the antibodies. So, you know, some of the things I would point out here is that this is only one piece of the instruction booklet for the virus. So it's impossible for you to get COVID infection from the vaccine itself, because it's just one little piece of the instructions. It has no part of the virus itself. And the fact that the mRNA breaks down so quickly, and we have to surround it in these salts and fats, which get broken down pretty quickly in your body, mean this vaccine is not hanging out in your body for a long time. And in fact, it gets broken down within a couple of days. And another important thing is you'll notice that the nucleus of our cells is over here. The nucleus is where the DNA of our bodies live. The vaccine components never enter into the nucleus where the DNA is. So nothing about the vaccine is impacting or changing or interacting with your DNA. All the vaccine is doing is telling your body, here are some instructions, follow it and make these spike proteins. So this is a nice picture of how the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines work. The Johnson & Johnson is a little bit different. Instead of putting these instructions inside of fats and salts, they attached the instructions to a piece of another virus called the adenovirus, which is, it causes all sorts of things, usually the common cold. But since they attached it to just a piece of that virus, you can't get this cold or the virus from the vaccine itself. It's just a different way of carrying the instructions into our cells. So before we talk about how effective the vaccines are, we have to define a few things. So spread has to do with the likelihood of passing the virus to other people if we are infected. Infection means the virus is in us and we may or may not have symptoms, even though the virus is in us. Disease means the virus is in us and we are feeling sick, we're having symptoms. Hospitalization, so the virus has caused us to be sick enough to need to be in the hospital. Death, we got sick enough that, that somebody died. And then cases are anybody who tests positive for COVID-19. And so they may just have an infection and not be symptomatic, or they may be symptomatic. And then long-lasting symptoms are symptoms that it's still being defined can last longer than 4 weeks or 12 weeks, and some people over 6 months. But these are symptoms that last a long time and can interfere with someone's ability to do their usual activities during the day. I will address some concerns that these numbers are being inflated in terms of hospitalizations and death. And so with hospitalization, yes, you could be admitted for something unrelated to COVID, like an infection on your toe, nothing to do with COVID, but you are getting tested for COVID when you're admitted to the hospital, and maybe you test positive even though you're not symptomatic from that. So that does happen. But of the 72 people in our hospital in Grants Pass this morning, I was aware of 2 people who fit that category, 2 out of 72. So it's really the minority of cases. And the reason we have to still track those people, and it's important to know about them, is because it impacts how they get roomed in the hospital, if they can share a room or not with someone else. It impacts how much personal protective equipment is needed for staff. And it also impacts how much staff are needed to take care of that person. So that's why they are still followed in the numbers. And then in terms of deaths, again, there's some concern from the public that those numbers are being inflated. One example I heard was, someone died of pneumonia, not from COVID. Well, they wouldn't have ended up with that pneumonia if they didn't have the COVID infection to begin with. So when someone is infected with COVID and they die of something related to the COVID, and they wouldn't have died otherwise, that is counted as a COVID-related death, because they wouldn't have ended up with the pneumonia if they hadn't had COVID, so they wouldn't have died if they hadn't had COVID. So there are some nuances, but Dr. Nelson rounding in the ICU and me seeing the numbers come in, we don't have any reason to falsify these numbers. It doesn't do us any good. Dr. Nelson would rather be doing his surgeries for cancer patients than acting as an internal medicine doctor. And I would rather have everybody, not wearing masks and going to work freely, but that's not where we are. And so the reason we look at these numbers so carefully is to help us figure out how can we get through this in the quickest and most safe way possible. So I just wanted to address some of those concerns that I've heard about inflating numbers. Okay, so now that we know those definitions, so how effective are the vaccines at preventing spread? And there is a fairly large study. Remember, the more people that are studied, the more powerful or trustworthy that study is. And this study involved quite a few people, so it's powerful. They looked at a fully vaccinated person who still ended up getting infected with COVID and whether or not they passed the disease to other people in their household. So people they were interacting with closely and regularly. And they found that they had a 71% lower chance of transmitting the disease to people in their household. And then if their other household members were also vaccinated, it was a further 75% reduction. So what does that mean? If vaccination brings 90% protection for you against getting infected in the first place, that means your risk is now dropped to 10%. And then 70% protection against transmitting to others, that means your risk of passing this along to others drops to 3%. And then if they're also vaccinated, 75% decreased risk. We're now at less than 1% of this disease being passed around. And I will say this study was done when the Alpha variant was dominant. Right now we have Delta variant, which does behave differently. But even if we said, okay, maybe the current vaccine protects against 50% of infections, which is lower than likely, but let's make it really extreme, if it only protects 50% against infection, when you still go through this algorithm, you end up with less than 4% risk of contracting disease, spreading it to others, and particularly if the others are also vaccinated. So that's why these vaccines are so powerful. And that's why they're so important, especially right now as we're seeing so much disease in our community. So how effective are the vaccines against cases, people testing positive for COVID? This is a graph of Oregon numbers statewide through the end of last week. And the dotted orange line represents people who are unvaccinated and testing positive, obviously going up at a much higher rate than this gray line, which are breakthrough cases, people who are vaccinated and still getting COVID-19 infection. And this is happening, the unvaccinated are getting infected at a rate 6 times higher than the vaccinated. And I'll show you on the next slide, that number is the same for Josephine County as well. So yes, the vaccine does decrease the number of cases that occur. So just to understand what a breakthrough case is, it's a case of COVID-19 and someone who's already been fully vaccinated, and you reach full vaccination status 2 weeks after your final dose of the vaccine. So 2 weeks after your second dose of Pfizer, 2 weeks after your second dose of Moderna, 2 weeks after your single dose of Johnson & Johnson. So if we look at Josephine County in particular, of everyone who's been vaccinated, 1.3% have gone on to test positive for COVID. That's pretty impressive that the vaccine has protected so many people. Now, last week, out of all of our cases, 15% were breakthrough cases. This is where I got the 6 times as likely to be infected if you're unvaccinated number from. And 15% might sound worrisome, but keep in mind, as our vaccination rates increase, so do breakthrough cases. So if you have a room of 100 people and only one person is vaccinated, the highest number of breakthrough cases you can have is 1 or 1%. On the other extreme, if you have a room of 100 people and all 100 of those people are vaccinated, remember the vaccine's not perfect, so the virus could potentially still spread. So if all those people are vaccinated, then anybody who gets a case of COVID is going to be a breakthrough case, and 100% of those cases will be breakthrough cases. So we have to keep that in mind as our vaccine rates climb. So will the breakthrough cases. But a total of 1.3% total have tested positive among those vaccinated in Josephine County. And then, of course, we also want to remember our biggest focus is on preventing hospitalizations and death. And it is very effective in that manner still. So far, of those who were vaccinated and still died, all but one were elderly. All of them had severe underlying medical conditions that predisposed them to getting sicker from the disease. On the other hand, we are seeing young, healthy, unvaccinated individuals who are getting very sick and dying. We have people in their 20s and 30s in the hospital right now who are on oxygen and have been ventilated. And we have had those deaths occurring now. And you know, the vaccine is very likely to have protected them. Okay, so continuing this thought, are the vaccines effective? Asante does this really nice summary each day. And at the bottom, you can see the website that you can go to see the summary each day. The red or orange color are unvaccinated, blue represents vaccinated, and then the shapes represent age. So a triangle, you can see as of this morning, there were 2 children hospitalized. The circle is 18 to 64, and that diamond is older than 65. And so you can see that if everyone was vaccinated, we would have far fewer people in the hospital. We would still have people in the hospital, but it wouldn't be overwhelming. And of those who are on breathing machines, on ventilators, every single one of them is unvaccinated. But yes, we do have deaths in people who are vaccinated. And like I said, those tend to be people who are older and very sick otherwise. So I encourage you to look at that if you want each day. I think it's a great way that Asante is trying to be transparent about what we're seeing right now. Okay, effectiveness of vaccines against long-term symptoms. If you're vaccinated and you still get sick, we don't have the data yet to know if the vaccine will help prevent those long-term symptoms. But we know that if we can prevent the infection in the first place, we can prevent long-term symptoms. And unfortunately, some people are ending up with these long-term symptoms much longer than we initially thought they would. So overall, that total line shows that almost a quarter of people do end up with symptoms longer than 4 weeks. I should mention this is a study looking at almost 2 million people in the US. If you start out without symptoms and it takes a while to develop symptoms, 19% maintain symptoms longer than 4 weeks. If you started out symptomatic but not hospitalized, a quarter of those people will still have symptoms after 4 weeks. And among those who are hospitalized, half of them still have symptoms 4 weeks past the time of diagnosis. And so that can really be impactful on someone's life, even if they don't end up dying. So always in medicine, we are looking at risk versus benefit. What's going to bring greater benefit to the person sitting in front of us? And so right now in Josephine County, overall, our hospitalization rate is 7.7% of those who test positive for COVID. And the death rate overall since COVID started is 1.7%. So, and those are fairly similar to what we're seeing nationwide. So keep those numbers in mind for this next slide, which is fairly busy. I'll describe it, but then take a step back at what the big picture is. And I'm almost done talking so we can get to your questions and answers. So hang in there with me. So on the far left are the list of side effects that we know, negative side effects that we know of from these vaccines. Anaphylaxis is a severe allergic reaction. The thrombosis and thrombocytopenia is that unusual clotting disease from Johnson & Johnson. Guillain-Barré is some paralysis that can happen that's been seen in Johnson & Johnson. The myocarditis, pericarditis is the heart inflammation that has been seen after Pfizer and Moderna. And then death, we know what death is. So the second column tells you which vaccines we've seen it associated with. The next column shows the risk of that happening from the vaccine itself. And then the last two columns, I compared that risk from the vaccine to the risk from getting sick from COVID itself. And so you can see, we'll look at the bottom at the death column. If you get sick from COVID, you're almost 5,000 times more likely to end up in the hospital than if you get vaccinated, okay? Meaning as a result of the vaccine. If you get sick from COVID, you're 1,000 times more likely to die from the disease itself than you are to die from the vaccine itself. And obviously some of those numbers just skyrocket. The allergic reaction is, you're much more likely to have that after getting sick from COVID than from the vaccine itself. And I would just point out that all of these side effects actually can happen from the disease. And so sometimes it helps me to compare to something else I'm more familiar with. So we give women birth control pills, and there's lots of reasons for doing that, but one of those sometimes is to prevent pregnancy. And we know that birth control pills can cause clotting, but we're trying to prevent pregnancy, and pregnancy has a higher risk of clotting than the birth control pills themselves. And so we say, okay, we talk through the risks of this clotting for you, and because that risk is lower by using the preventive measure than the thing we're trying to prevent, it's okay. We're going to accept that risk. And it's similar with these COVID-19 vaccines. Yes, there is risk with the vaccines, but the risk is far lower from the vaccine than from the actual disease itself. Okay, so the last few slides are just addressing some concerns and questions about side effects that are fairly common. People are concerned about putting something foreign into their bodies. we put foreign things into our bodies every day. And I would argue Doritos have more foreign ingredients in them than these vaccines. And Doritos stay in your body longer than these vaccines. And yet the vaccines have been studied, far more than any other vaccine in history, 2 million people in the US. Some people maybe are concerned that they might get the COVID disease itself from the vaccine. And I talked at the beginning about how that's not possible. If you have a recipe for brownies and you give me the first 2 steps of the instructions for making those brownies, I'm not going to have brownies in front of me. So just taking the instructions for the spike protein for the virus is not going to give me the disease itself. I will mention it does take 2 weeks after that final dose to get full coverage because your body has to form that immune system. I showed you the pictures that the vaccines do not enter the nucleus of your cells. It does not interact with your DNA. The vaccines degrade very quickly over a couple of days. The spike proteins go away after a couple of weeks, but your body remembers what they look like so that they can recognize them in the future should your body see the virus. There are no long-term effects observed, and it's been more than a year since the first Pfizer doses were given. We haven't seen any long-term negative side effects as a result. And keep in mind, this is not the first time that this technology has been used. It's been studied for a couple of decades. It's been used against cancer. It was used against the Zika virus. So we do have long-term data in that way, and there have not been any concerns in the long run. And in general, we've been studying vaccines for over 100 years. And by far and away, the vast majority of side effects occur in the first 60 days after a vaccine is given. And we're over a year out from the first Pfizer doses being given. There's a lot of concern about the vaccines causing infertility. There is no evidence of that at all. Concern about harm to a pregnant mother or her fetus, or if she's breastfeeding. And again, there's no evidence of that. And in fact, getting the vaccine can help protect the mother against getting COVID disease, which would put her and the baby at risk. And getting the vaccine will allow the mom to have antibodies that get passed to the baby, whether in utero or through breast milk. And that in turn helps to protect the baby as well. And the only true contraindication to the vaccine is if you've already gotten the vaccine and you had an anaphylactic reaction, that severe allergic reaction, which again is very rare. Okay, what if you're young and healthy? Do you really need to get this vaccine? Well, again, most people who end up severely ill or hospitalized or die already have underlying conditions and are elderly. So it makes sense to think that maybe I don't need to get it if I'm young and healthy. But we are seeing an increasing number of young, previously healthy people who are getting very sick. Half of our cases right now are under age 50. Last week, we had 9 people under age 50 hospitalized, and we have several people in their 20s and 30s in the hospital right now. And so we can't always predict who's going to get very sick from the disease, but the vaccine helps to decrease that risk. It minimizes your vulnerability there. If you've already been sick from COVID-19, it is still recommended that you go on to get the vaccination. That's because you get an even greater protection. So for many people, the disease does build your immune system and allow your body to protect itself if it sees the virus again. But that level of protection is not consistent. Whereas with the vaccines, it's pretty consistent, with the exception being people who are severely immunocompromised. And so the vaccine will consistently give you a certain level of protection, whereas disease doesn't. And of course, disease carries all of these other risks with it. And so a study, at the bottom of my slides, I've given you links to all of the studies that I'm mentioning, so you're welcome to look them up. But in people who got sick from COVID and did not get vaccinated afterwards, they were 2.34 times more likely to get infected again from COVID compared to people who got sick and did go on to get vaccinated. So we know that that vaccine gives your body this extra boost of protection. I saw some questions in the Q&A, so I'll hit those now. If you've been sick from COVID, the timing for being able to get the vaccine is once your isolation period ends. That's either 10 days or 20 days, depending on how sick you were, and when you're feeling better. If you receive a treatment called monoclonal antibodies to help you get through the COVID disease, that can be an IV infusion or 4 injections all at once. So you would remember one of those things if you got it. If you don't remember that, then you didn't get the monoclonal antibody treatment. If you got that treatment, then you wait 90 days from the time of treatment before getting the vaccine. Okay. So we have several dates set up for coming out to schools for vaccine clinics to try and make it as easy as possible and meet you where you're at. If none of those times work, we have a phone number in Josephine County that you can call, English or Spanish. They will direct you to all of the places in town that have vaccines available. They also can answer questions. And then you can also, if you want to schedule an appointment for a vaccine, you can go to the website listed there and you're able to schedule that. So I might leave that up for writing down that information, but I'm sure the schools will send that out and we can start answering any questions.
All right, well, thank you both very much. Matt was very insightful, and I definitely will think twice about Doritos in addition to everything else you both have shared. We do have a number of questions, so I want to make sure we get them addressed, and you may have answered them along the way, but maybe just recapture them again. So I'll just go ahead and read them, and we'll just kind of go through them. So Michelle's asking, why does anyone talk about our own immunity? Why doesn't anyone talk about our own immunity? Will it count if I already have had COVID? You kind of addressed that a little bit. Leona, do you want to address that again?
Yeah, so, you know, your immunity does count for something, but because we can't accurately know what level of protection you and your neighbor and the next person down got after being sick from COVID, we're led to rely on the vaccine immunity because that is more reliable. And then furthermore, again, that study that showed if you get vaccinated even after illness, you actually get an even bigger boost in protection. Great question.
Great. Anonymous asks, why should I get the vaccine when reports are coming out that the antibodies are actually more effective in fighting off the virus as well as the variant, especially when I've had COVID recently? That's a little related to what you just answered.
Yeah, so there was one report that came out, I believe, over the weekend or end of last week. It's in a preprint. So that means it hasn't been peer reviewed. It hasn't gone through this rigorous, discussion and review by other scientists and doctors to say, was the study done well? Was it not? So that's still in preprint. And it was one study compared to several studies that have shown us that yes, you do get some natural immunity after disease, but immunity after vaccine is greater. It's bigger.
Okay.
So I would say, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just so that actually was an example that I read this weekend. I saw that same report and there was a hyperlink to the study. And so I was interested in seeing what the study results were. So I clicked on the hyperlink. It took me to the study in big bold letters. It said exactly that. This is a preprint study. It has not been approved. It is not a peer-reviewed, approved journal article. And so, again, I just go back to what I was saying at the first. We need to know where to get good information. And just because a reporter, takes a non-peer-reviewed journal and then makes an article about it, casting in doubt what other studies have said, especially when that article has not been approved yet, you have to go back to where are we getting our information and who's saying what. And so anyway, I appreciate the question. Thank you, Leona, for answering that. And I'm sorry to jump in, but I read that article this weekend and then I clicked on the hyperlink and it was confirmation to me that people are writing things without it being peer reviewed and approved yet. And so that is causing a lot of confusion that people have about what's going on because so much information is getting out so quickly and it's not always correct. So anyway.
Yeah, and it's a lot to process for all of us, Tara's asking if you, and I think we've kind of answered this a little bit, but I think this is a little technical. So if you recently had COVID, do you need to wait the 90 days before being vaccinated? And it sounds like there was a procedure that may have say yes, but that may not be true for everybody.
Right, so you wait 90 days if you received monoclonal antibody treatment, that IV infusion or 4 injections all at once. Otherwise, you wait until your isolation period is over and you're feeling better.
Great. Michelle's asking, so why is the research so hidden and not shared openly with the public?
I'll tackle this one. I don't think that it's hidden. I think that people just don't know where to go to find the information because we live in such a readily information accessible world. Everything just shows up on our feeds. We can just open up the news and it's just everything's there. But if you're really trying to find the real research, you do have to look for it. You have to know where to go. And so you have to go to the right websites like the CDC, you have to know how to work PubMed. And so some of these are more technically challenging. It is not just accessible at your fingertips. And that is unfortunate. And I think the news media, to their credit, does try to put out that information, but they're always trying to get you to read the next article. And so just like this last example of they're making articles about research that hasn't really been approved yet, and it's a little bit inciting, right? So everybody wants to see what else is coming. And so they're just trying to get eyeballs on their website and trying to get people to read things. And it creates a world of misinformation out there. So it's not that it's hidden, it's just, it's not easy to find oftentimes. And that has been a huge problem that the medical community is trying to fix in forums like this. So.
Great. Tara's asking, again, I think we kind of answered this, but always good to repeat it. What is the benefit of the vaccine for me if I've recently had COVID and have antibodies to the latest variant?
Yeah, so again, I think it's that variable response rate after disease that is uncertain. And whereas when you compare it to your response after the vaccine itself, it's more reliable. And then also, sharing about the study that showed that if you do not go on to get vaccinated after being sick, you are more than 2 times as likely to end up getting infected again.
Got it. Michelle's asking, if I get the vaccine in 8 months, am I going to be threatened with this booster too? That might be a policy issue. We might be able to address, is there going to be a booster or something like that? I'm not sure about policy. That would be something different.
Yeah, so I first would just say I don't know of any doctors who wish to threaten anybody. So I'm sorry that you're feeling that way. And I can see how you would definitely be feeling that way right now. In terms of boosters, so the thing that's approved right now is for people who are moderately or severely immunocompromised, and there's some very strict requirements around that. They can get a 3rd dose. And that's because their bodies were unlikely to have responded as robustly as we would have wanted to the first 2 doses, the way that someone else's body already has. We are hearing that there are going to be boosters coming down the line, and that's a little different. So that means if the vaccines aren't quite as strong over time, then you get this extra dose to remind your body of what the disease looks like so that it can still have a nice strong response. And I would say in terms of policy, I think probably that's going to have to wait to be seen. And I don't have the answer to that. But just like a lot with COVID, we're learning more and more as time goes on. And we'll see what the situation is locally and in our country when we get there.
Right. Very good.
I think it's important to add with the booster too, even though it wasn't stated, was that it is not a different vaccine. It is the same vaccine. And I think that should just let people know that the vaccine is working. We are just trying to remind your immune system of the, and to make the antibodies that you need to be protected. So the booster shot, if and when that comes, is not going to be a different vaccine. It's the same vaccine because the vaccine is holding its own against all of the variants thus far.
We do the same thing with other vaccines, tetanus and measles for kids. And it's very common to give boosters for vaccines so that it reminds the body of what it needs to do.
Yep. That makes sense. An anonymous attendee, if this is about being pregnant. So if in terms of a pregnant woman receiving the vaccine, how can studies say that there are no long-term side effects when the vaccine has only been available for 9 months and it might have been available a bit longer than that, but vaccines and pregnancy?
Yeah, so keep in mind the first doses were given over a year ago, and some of those initial recipients were pregnant without realizing it because they were early in pregnancy. And since then, pregnant women have received the vaccine and gone on to deliver healthy babies. And so there has not been any link to causing early delivery, miscarriages, to causing fetal death, to causing harm to the babies like malformations. There have been no links of that sort.
Very good to hear, actually. Another anonymous attendee, and this is more about policy, I think. So again, we're really focused on the medical side of it, but if every medical practice is based on the individual patient, then how can you apply a mandate to all when we're all different? So maybe just from a physician side, what would be the benefit of a widespread vaccine? We really can't answer the policy question probably.
Yeah, so the only contraindication is if you've had an anaphylactic, a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine already. There's no other true reason why you cannot receive the vaccine. Now, there are some nuances. If you have a history of clotting disease, then you may not choose to get the Johnson & Johnson. You may want to get one of the other ones. If Johnson & Johnson was the only vaccine available, then you would still be safer to get the vaccine than to get sick from COVID itself. But we do have 3 different vaccines available. And so I think that's where talking to your provider comes really into play, because they know your full history. And so they can help guide, well, this one vaccine may be safer for you than the other. That's the one that would be recommended for you. There's really no contraindications to these particular vaccines.
Great.
I would echo that. I think it's very important to have a conversation with your provider about your medical history, what's going on. And I have those conversations every day with my patients. And I have patients who are taking very strong immunosuppressive medications for Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, or lots of different things. And so there are some nuances there that we need to look at. And so that is a conversation that people should have with their provider about, when should I get the vaccine? When is it most appropriate? And what does that look like for me? So.
And I will say, if you don't have a primary care provider or a provider that you can go talk to, anytime you go get the vaccine, you fill out a short questionnaire about your medical history, and it hits on some of these things that allows guidance on which vaccine may be better suited for you. So that is still looked at no matter where you get your vaccine.
Great. Todd is asking a question. Would the difference between 50% currently vaccinated and 70% herd immunity preferred vaccinated, 20%, truly make the difference in what we are seeing unfold in total cases?
I don't know that I understand the question completely. What I'm hearing is, does a 50% vaccination rate really make that big of a difference in the number of cases compared to a 70% vaccination rate in the population?
Yeah.
And it does. We've seen in our counties in Oregon that it makes a tremendous difference. Now, at what level we reach true herd immunity remains to be seen. And the estimates are actually somewhere between 80 and 90% immunity to really tamp this down and make it easier to live with.
I would just add that you can look at other counties with higher vaccination rates, and they're not seeing what we're seeing here. People are still getting sick, and it is typically the unvaccinated, but they do not have the run on their hospitals and the run on their community like we are having right now. So I think that, again, just bears out the scientific data, as you look at which counties have been more vaccinated and which are less, and then what we're seeing play out with the Delta variant. It's pretty clear that the vaccinated counties closer to 70 or 80% are having far fewer infections than we are.
Right, so we can actually see it in our own data. Very good. Natalie's asking, how can we be sure there will be no long-term effects? You touched on a little bit, Dr. O'Keefe, but maybe a little more in depth.
Yeah, so in the history of vaccines, most side effects, by far and away, the majority of side effects occur in the first 60 days after the vaccine is given. And then in particular for this vaccine, we've seen it in use for over a year. So we're well beyond that 60-day mark. And also, this technology is not brand new. It's been used in other cases. So as a vaccine against Zika virus was used about 4 years ago. We haven't seen any long-term negative side effects. And those people, mRNA technology has been used for over a decade, including in things like cancer. We haven't seen negative long-term effects there.
Great. Another anonymous attendee, how come natural immunity isn't being discussed? We've talked about it a little bit, but maybe a little more in depth. We have heard all about the breakthrough cases the different variants are causing, but you hardly hear about repeat infections.
So I think you're asking about people who get reinfected after you get infected once by disease and then you get infected again by disease, as opposed to breakthrough infections where you get infected after vaccination. I mean, there are studies on that, and it shows that reinfection is possible, and the reinfection is more likely in those who don't go on to get vaccinated. You know, you can go on OHA, they are tracking natural immunity to the best of their abilities to do so. You know, we don't know about every case that's happened. And again, we don't know what level of protection comes for every single person who's been infected with COVID. So it's a little bit tricky. They have to take those variables into account. But there are graphs that show the estimated number of people who have natural immunity, and that is being taken into account for the total level of immunity in the state of Oregon. So I don't think it's being ignored. I think, again, it comes back to knowing where to find the information, and there's so much information out there that it can be tricky. But Oregon Health Authority, OHA, there's a lot of stuff there, but if you can click around and learn your way through it, that graph is there. I just looked at it today.
Great. Timothy, not so much asking a question, but it's about FDA approval does not necessarily mean that it's safe. He's citing a PBS publication in June of 2018 that they did. FDA increasingly approves drugs without conclusive proof that they work. I don't know if you have a comment or anything, but that.
Well, just, I mean, as I said at the beginning, you know, these organizations are not infallible, right? I think this is good people trying to do the best that they can. The FDA is very good at scrutinizing drugs. I don't think that every drug that it's approved has always panned out. In fact, there are several examples where we could say, yeah, things didn't work well. If you're interested in reading about the history of cancer, there's a book entitled The Emperor of All Maladies, which is an excellent read on the history of our treatment for cancer in the United States. And there are several examples in there where things didn't always go as planned and the reasons why that is. However, I do think it's important to remember this. I just checked the CDC website today. So we've administered in this country over 340 million doses of the vaccine. And I can't think of any other medication that has been so widely used in a population. And, you know, they are tracking this vaccine more closely than any other medication, I'll bet, in the history of the world. I mean, everybody is watching this. And so from a safety standpoint and an efficacy standpoint, does this work? I mean, we know more about this vaccine than we do about most anything that people are taking, including Tylenol and ibuprofen and Prilosec and all sorts of medicines that we take. So does the FDA always get things right? Probably not, but are they getting this right? That's probably the most important question. And I think the answer is, as we look at how many people have received it, hundreds of millions, and how well it's working, the answer is yes, it is safe and effective. So.
Yeah, and just to echo that a little bit, you know, I think a lot of people are familiar with VAERS, which is a vaccine tracking system to see what, you know, potential negative things come of vaccines that are used. And I would say that typically those side effects are underreported for a lot of vaccines. But for this vaccine, it is under such scrutiny and being watched so closely. And furthermore, there's a thing called vSafe. So everyone who receives the vaccine gets a handout. They can sign up for vSafe. You get these little text messages, very quick, easy polls to say how you're doing, what side effects you've had. I would say compared to any vaccine we've ever used, this one has more information than all the other ones in the past. And so I think the FDA has more information to look at on this vaccine than anything in history. So we can kind of, again, it has to do with numbers, right? The greater the number of people who are having some intervention, the more reassured we can be that the positive impact is true and that we're catching any negative impacts that may result.
Great. Brittany's asking, after a positive COVID test, how long should I wait before getting the vaccine? I heard it's safer to wait a few months after being sick. I think you already answered this at least once.
Yeah, so typically if you're not hospitalized if you're not hospitalized when sick with COVID, then your isolation period ends after 10 days. And if you're feeling better at that point, then you can get the vaccine.
So pretty soon. Cindy's asking, question about MRC5. What is it exactly, and is it in the mRNA vaccines? MRC-5.
I am not familiar with MRC-5.
Yeah, I don't know what that is either.
So maybe Cindy, you could throw that in the chat, and then we could see if we could help look that up for you. Anonymous attendee, are the hospitals, physicians going to take responsibility if I have an adverse reaction? Are you willing to pay my medical if I have an adverse reaction?
So hospitals and physicians are, I guess, always held liable for anything that goes on. So you can always find an attorney to sue us if things don't go well. And if that's what you're asking for, to get the vaccine, then I would say we're always here. So and there's always attorneys who are willing to sue physicians and hospital systems, I guess. But I have attended many of the Josephine County vaccination events that we held here. I served as a medical director for many of them in February and March, as did many of my colleagues. Thousands of people came through, and I watched people in the thousands get vaccinations, and we didn't have any complications. No one ended up in the hospital. So I would just strongly encourage you that you will be safe as you get the vaccine. Hundreds of millions of people have received it.
Great, thank you. Mickey, thank you, Mickey. Good to hear from you. She is saying the MRC-5 fibroblast cell line, perhaps? Does that ring a bell?
I wonder if I can put, because I think really the crux of the question is what are the ingredients in the vaccines?
Okay.
So in the chat, I put a link to the CDC, which tells you the exact ingredients for each of the vaccines available to us. And there's nothing fetal in any of the vaccines.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Dr. O'Keefe, the MRC-5 was a cell line, infinite cell line that has been used in the development of some vaccines in the past. And I believe the question is, was that cell line used in the development of these vaccines? But it wasn't clear in the question itself.
All right. Learning science. I love it. It's great. Cheryl's asking a question about, because there's no long-term studies, can you guarantee the vaccine isn't going to give me cancer down the road or heart issues, et cetera?
I think at some point we have to trust the data that's already here. And as we've said, there is more data for this than almost anything else in medicine. We put all sorts of things into our bodies, whether they're blood pressure medicines or natural supplements. There is just so much data here. I'm vaccinated, my husband's vaccinated. As soon as my kids can get vaccinated, they will be vaccinated as well. So I am very much trusting what we already know about these vaccines.
Yeah, I would echo that too. People want 100% guarantee. I guess we can't say 100%, but I can say with 99.9999% confidence that you're not going to get cancer from getting a vaccine, especially these vaccines. And we have the data for heart disease and pericarditis, and you can see all of that. And the risk for that is extremely low. It is far less than 1%. It is 0.0001% based on the total number of people who have received the vaccine. So, again, they're very safe, and it has been demonstrated that over time. So,
I often talk to my patients that anything that we do in medicine holds some level of risk, which again comes back to weighing those risks versus benefits. And if I know that something is riskier for someone than helpful, I'm not going to give it to them. That's why we don't give aspirin to every single person over age 40, because there's too much risk with it. But in certain people, the benefit now becomes greater than the risk. And with these vaccines, we know that the risk from the vaccine is far, far, far smaller than the risk from getting sick from the disease itself.
Okay, this anonymous attendee said, I read that they looked at a cadaver who was vaccinated and the mRNA was in every organ of the body. How can we argue with that? I have not read that particular article, but is that something that either of you run up against?
I haven't seen that article, and I would say that what we know more fully is that the mRNA is so fragile that they struggle to know how to get it to last long enough to be injected into your body. And so all the evidence I've seen is that the mRNA breaks down within a couple of days and is not just hanging out in our bodies. But I'm not familiar with that particular thing. And I think, again, that comes back to where are we getting our information from?
Yeah, I would appreciate if maybe they could put a source where that article is from, and I'd be happy to look at it and see where their source is from. And I guess I would just encourage people to go back and look for the very first source of information. As we read things, we need to be more discriminatory about where are they getting their facts from, and we have to get back to where truth is found. And that is really important as we do this. We can't take everything that we read online or listen to, at face value. We have to go back and look. And I appreciate Dr. O'Keefe. She's been putting her sources for what we're saying on her slides. Like, we're trying to report, this is where this information is coming from. And we just need to go back to that. As you read something, you really need to be asking those questions. Where are they getting their information from? Is this really factual, or is this, just, is it more inflammatory maybe? So,
yeah, this is really tough, and there's a lot of fear out there for sure. Robert's asking, I have employees that are pregnant and worried about getting the vaccine while they're pregnant. They've been told the vaccine is FDA approved, so it's safe. However, are the vaccines approved for children 0 to 5? If not, it seems incongruous to ask pregnant women to get vaccinated if it's not approved for young children.
There's two separate questions in there. The first one, are these vaccines approved for ages 0 to 5? No, we're expecting ages 5 to 11 to be coming in October or November, and then ages 6 months through 4 at the beginning of the next year. But scientifically, what we know is that when we give a vaccine to a woman who is pregnant, it's her body that is reacting to the vaccine and forming the antibodies. It's the antibodies, the immune system component, that passes the placenta into the baby, so into the fetus. So the fetus is not having to do all of that work. It's just like everything else. It just gets to hang out and grow and have mom feed it everything it needs. And it's the same thing with the antibodies. And then if the mom is breastfeeding, same thing. If we give the vaccine to the mom, the vaccine components itself are not passing to the baby. Only the antibodies are passing to the baby. So the mom's body does all the work, and then it gives the baby all the benefit.
Michael, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I added to the chat, if you have access to it, a report that summarizes a lot of the research that we have around COVID-19 and prenatal health, both for COVID and for the vaccine. And it lists the 50 or so sources that we used in making that evaluation. We do need to update it. It's a couple months old, but it's a really good starting point.
Great. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to repost it. It went to the hosted panelists. You have to make sure you do the drop down that goes to everybody. Yeah.
Will do. Thank you.
Got it. Yeah, no, all good. I'll make sure people have it. The next announcement is there's not a question in there, just a question about the reality of individuals' health. There isn't a question in there though. They just questioning the data is what I think that is. Next one is not a question. Question, who is liable for injury, death from the vaccine? We kind of talked about that earlier, Dr. Nelson. I don't know if there's anything else you need to add to that.
Say, on the other end of the picture is so far when someone gets sick from COVID infection and ends up hospitalized, their bills have been waived. And now I'm hearing that the insurance companies are no longer going to waive those fees. So at some point, if you want to weigh out what's riskier, ending up harmed and having hospital bills from the vaccine versus harm and hospital bills from the disease, and you want to place a bet, you're going to go with the vaccine because it's much less risky.
Great. Cheryl's about a policy question. This should not be a mandated vaccine. If we were to get this vaccine, where do we get the FDA approved? I'm not Comirnaty?
Comirnaty is just the new name for the Pfizer vaccine. Now that it has approval, they're allowed to give it a fancy name.
Gotcha.
And so you can get that at many, many places in the county. That phone number website I gave you, it's just the Pfizer vaccine with a new name, or at any of the vaccine clinics on the campuses, we'll have all three of the vaccines available.
Beautiful. Announcement attendee, I got COVID a few weeks ago. My body fought it off naturally. Great job, by the way. Is it safe for me to go right in and get vaccinated immediately after? I think you answered this earlier a couple of times. When you're feeling well, you can go back in. Wouldn't my body be an overload is the question. And also, is it really necessary to get a vaccine to build natural immunities when my body already did the work to build natural immunities? And I think you answered that already, that the results, if you get the vaccine afterwards, that your response later on is going to be better. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the question about overload, sometimes that comes up with parents who are concerned about giving more than one vaccine at once to their children. And our kids are crawling around on the floor and putting things in their mouths, and they're actually exposed to thousands of germs every day. And so if you give them 4 vaccines at once, it's a much smaller dose of any kind of exposure than what they're exposed to on a daily basis. So I don't think your body would be overloaded. I think you would be okay so long as you meet the other criteria we've already talked about.
Great. So it should be fine. Another attendee, of course, this is their evidence. There's there is no, it must be no evidence to infertility because it just came out. These are not studied yet. So I think just a comment about impact on fertility.
Well, to diagnose infertility, you have to have not been able to get pregnant after regularly trying for a year, and we're at over a year. So we do have enough data.
Back to the viral load, we are dealing with the Delta at this time, according to everybody. So this in fact is a true statement regarding the viral load. It was a response to maybe part of the presentation.
That was a response to me, actually. I typed a response to an earlier question
Gotcha.
about viral load. There was a pre-study that was done that stated that those who have Delta variant have a 251 times higher viral load in the nostrils. And that was misquoted as saying that vaccinated people have a 251 times higher viral load. So it was misciting the original source. So that higher viral load is in reference to the type of variant you have. It wasn't in reference to whether or not a person was vaccinated. And I posted a link both to the original article and to the article that was misciting it.
Thank you for clarifying. Can you clarify whether Comirnaty is the only FDA-approved vaccine and Pfizer has an extended EUA? I know that an announcement said they are legally distinct. I'm not finding Comirnaty anywhere.
So initially, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson were all under the emergency use authorization, which means they had anyone could administer those vaccines and feel safe to do so. But they needed to undergo further investigation and discussion to have the full FDA approval. So right now, the one that has received the full FDA approval is the Pfizer vaccine, which is now renamed Comirnaty. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing.
Got it. What about reports coming out of Israel, which has the highest vaccination rates in the world, and they are absolutely slammed with the COVID cases?
So my understanding is they still had a population of people that were actually very lowly vaccinated, and those were the young people, particularly in their 20s and 30s, which is the same population that the US struggles to vaccinate as well. Because when we're in our 20s and 30s, we're very social. Typically, I'm making generalizations here, but people tend to be very social and to feel rather invincible and healthy, and I don't need to get vaccinated. But the fact that they're so social also means they're the ones spreading it the most. And so they really are an important population to still get vaccinated, not only to protect them, but to protect the entire society against the spread of the virus. And again, as your vaccine rates increase, you're going to see more breakthrough cases. But yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind is each population has multiple variables that have to be looked at. So how dense is the population? Are people riding the subway every day? Are they living in packed apartment houses or in spread out farms? What's the temperature like there? How much sunlight are they getting? All of these things impact how well the virus does or does not spread. And so while we look at Israel because they've been a step ahead of us much of the way, we want to know what's coming, and that's helpful to know what's going on there. They're not an exact replica of us in Josephine County. So we just have to keep in mind that there's all of these other variables to look at as well.
That makes sense. Good information straight from the CDC is that yes, Pfizer has one that is FDA approved. It also is stated that is not even in production yet. Therefore, this should not even be pushed at this time. So please tell us where we can actually get the FDA approved vaccine. Is there a difference in how?
So the first part's correct. The CDC has given full approval to Pfizer, but it is available everywhere. It's exactly the same vaccine. It's just going to have a different name on the box.
Okay, so it's the same. It's the same. Yeah.
Same vaccine.
Same vaccine.
Real
Bottom line
changes the way it looks, but it's the exact same thing.
Yeah, right. What happens to a person's bodily autonomy? What's the bottom line? So probably the body's ability to fight off disease.
I think they mean autonomy, your ability to make choice. And of course, you can make your own choice. You don't have to get vaccinated. There just may be consequences to that you don't want.
Will there be more variants beyond Delta, and will these vaccines protect against those? And will these variants be as aggressive as the Delta is?
That's the million-dollar question.
Those were my exact words I was going to say.
We don't know. I mean, that's peering into the future. I do think that there are new variants that they're discovering, but whether or not they'll be as aggressive, we don't know yet. Thus far, the vaccines protect against all the known variants, but that may change, and we don't know that. So time will tell.
That's what I was talking about with the bit of the time crunch that we have. We want to limit the ability of the virus to mutate. And the best way we can do that is by limiting its ability to infect people. And the best way we can do that is through the vaccine.
Yeah. Makes sense. Timothy is not sure if you can answer this, but is one shot safer than another?
I think that's where talking to your personal provider comes into play, so that because they know your full history and they can help guide if you have anything that might put you at more risk with one of the vaccines rather than another.
I will say, though, that if you have a choice, if you can get any of them, I would choose the 2-dose vaccines. Those seem to have better efficacy. When we talk about the success rate of preventing infection and limiting spread, Moderna and Pfizer do have better outcomes than the Johnson & Johnson. So if you're going to choose one and you have that choice, I would choose those first the 2-dose shot.
Great. This may be another report that is incorrect, but I would like to know, there was a report that came out from the FDA that said they approved the Pfizer vaccine, that it is not available in the United States, Comirnaty, but the vaccine that is available in the US is not actually the same vaccine. So we kind of answered this above, I believe. But the Comirnaty is the very same one that's been approved. That is the same Pfizer vaccine. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Timothy, if the percent of those vaccinated lowers COVID, why is Israel seeing a spike in cases? I think we just kind of addressed that. Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think the question that it brings up is, do the vaccines wane over time in their efficacy, just like vaccines do. And I think that's a big part of the impetus for the White House saying we're planning on having boosters for everybody available soon. But the evidence is mixed. So, you know, I can't say for sure one way or the other, but I mean, that's what the big question is.
This one, should someone get a blood antibody level test before accepting vaccinations if they've recently had COVID-18 and received monoclonal antibodies? Can you get too many antibodies?
Just wait 90 days.
90 days.
Get an antibody test.
Yeah, 90 days. Why wouldn't the at-risk group age 50 plus be the first people who are mandated to receive the vaccines versus everybody in public schools, for example? Kind of
Well, because public school is required by law. I mean, well, not public school, but children are required by law to attend school. And so in order to, if you have to attend school, then we want to make it safe and not risk having people get very sick, long-term symptoms, or die. So that's my understanding of the thought process behind the mandate.
Do you understand people's skepticism when people have basically been bribed to get this vaccine and now are being threatened with our livelihood, especially when so many of us have already fought off the virus on our own?
I think the bribe is probably referring to the reward cards. And, you know, I don't think that anybody intended those to be a bribe. There are people who can't get to an appointment for a vaccine because they don't have the money available to pay for gas in their car to get to that appointment, or because they have children and can't take the kids with them to that appointment and they need to get a babysitter. And so this was a very real and tangible way to try and help those people who needed some financial support just to be able to access the vaccine.
Yeah. Natalie's question, the people having the anaphylaxis, over 1 million deaths, are they the same as are in the high risk for COVID mortality? It seems the risk versus benefit depends on your comorbidities.
There have not been over 1 million deaths from anaphylaxis due to the vaccine. The vaccines cause anaphylaxis in somewhere between 2 and 5 people out of every 1 million doses that are given. And so we have 369 million doses given in the US, then that doesn't equal 1 million people who have had anaphylaxis. And again, the risk of anaphylaxis after the vaccine is far lower than being hospitalized or dying from the disease.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you're absolutely right. Your comorbidities do, to a large degree, determine how likely you are to end up hospitalized or dying from COVID disease. But unfortunately, we can't rely on that entirely because we are seeing, again, healthy people and young people who still end up hospitalized and dying. We wouldn't have expected that because they didn't have any other comorbidities to tell us that we should have expected that.
Right. Anonymous attendee, so I'm interpreting it as none of the companies are liable for injury or death. If we trust it, then someone should be willing to be liable because there is some risk, even if you're claiming it is small.
You know, I would say I'm not a lawyer, so you can go talk to a lawyer.
Yeah. If the FDA approval, it said that Comirnaty was legally distinct from Pfizer. What is that referring to if they're the same?
I would think that that's just a time stamp of when the FDA provided their approval. And so if you call it the Pfizer vaccine, it's like a generic versus a name brand. So whatever is actually in the vaccine or in that pill, it's exactly the same, but it has a different name. And calling it Comirnaty indicates that it has the FDA approval. The ingredients are the same though.
We lost Dr. Nelson. I'm trying to get him to come back in again. Sorry, Scott. I don't see him coming back in. Let's do this last one here and I'll see if I can get him online. Going back to the FDA approval, it clearly states on page 33, in the 33-page document rather, on page, I think that's a 1. quote, the products are legally distinct with certain differences that do not impact safety or effectiveness. So that states that they are not the same, very similar. So BioNTech is the one in production and the one they will be giving. So technically this is not FDA approved.
Sorry, let me bring it up again to read there. If they're legally distinct because they have different names, because one gives you the timestamp of when it was FDA approved, I don't know how much more detail to go into to describe that difference.
I think there's a lot to try to be understood between what was here and then it was approved and then what it's known as. I don't wonder if that's also just the technical name maybe as well. I don't know. It does not say the name is different, and that is it. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that, Dr. O'Keefe?
No, I don't think
Okay.
so.
All right. All right. Those are all the questions that we have in there. I don't know if there was any in the chat because that's a different place. Let me just look and see. Policy. There's a question in the chat. It sounds like we might be worse without the vaccine, but why should this be mandated when it is going to change every year or perhaps every 5 months as it is appearing with the booster shot? So maybe if you could address, or is it possible to address that concept of if this is changing anyway, and then we're gonna have boosters, why is it? I don't know about the mandating part, that's a policy question, but the rapidity of the virus changing and then having vaccines or boosters to address that.
Well, I think we want to have vaccines against diseases that are preventable and against diseases that can really cause harm to people and disrupt society. So, the flu virus changes every year and we get a flu vaccine every year. It's been over a year and a half with COVID and over a year with the vaccine. And so far the vaccine is holding strong. And it's because that spike protein that the vaccine works against hasn't changed. Now it might change, in which case they would have to, alter the vaccine. I think the fortunate thing that we can be grateful for is that they know how to do that quickly because they've already done it. They just, that set of instructions, that mRNA, and use that as the vaccine. Is it possible that we're going to need doses regularly? At least for some time it's possible, but I don't know yet. I don't think anybody knows yet. And that's why we're hopeful that more people will get vaccinated now so that we can really tamp down the virus now and prevent that from being needed in the long run.
Okay, I think I found Scott while you were answering that question brilliantly. I don't know if I was able to get him back in again. Those are all the questions that we have. We are recording this whole thing and make this available to both districts to have for other staff who couldn't be here tonight. There he is. Hi, Dr. Nelson, welcome back. Any other things you would like to share with the folks that are online here? And Michael, I'll open this up to you as well if you have anything else you'd like to share.
No, I just thank you very much for having us and giving us the opportunity to respond to these questions. I purposefully stayed out just because I was trying to provide sources for people when they ask for them, and because I want people to talk to the doctors. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to myself or Dr. O'Keefe. I won't volunteer Dr. Nelson's time. I'll let him do that.
I'm happy to talk.
Our calendars are available. Anybody who wants time with us can have it. And we'll happily sit down with anyone that has questions.
Very good. All right. Well, I can't thank you enough. I learned a lot, and I'll also be thoughtful about what I eat. Also, that was the thing that just went into my brain, like, oh, I put stuff in my body that maybe I should be thoughtful about too. But appreciate your wisdom and counsel. And I know people are afraid, and hopefully you've helped answer some of those questions for folks and to alleviate some of those fears. It's still a very personal decision. We recognize that, but we want people to be safe. So appreciate your time and expertise, both of you, and for your service, what you're doing right now to help us all be well. And so I'll wrap this up, and I'll get the link out to both districts so it can be shared out for staff. And that's it. Thanks everybody for coming tonight, and appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.